Hey everybody, I'm Paul with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, Using a Secure Web API Web Service from a Mobile, presented by Technical Evangelist Don and Web Program Manager Mehul. Learn how to create a Web API service and then consume it using a hybrid mobile app or any client-side framework. In this webinar, Mehul and Don will show you what it takes to create a secure Web API service on the server side and what calls are needed to authorize and get the results in JSON format. This session is being recorded and will be available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We'll also do a live Q&A at the end of the presentation. Just type your questions into your GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. We will also be answering questions during the presentation as well. I'll now hand things over to Mehul and Don.
Thank you very much, Paul. Welcome, everybody. Don, how are you doing?
I'm fine, Mehul, and I'm ready to share some cool JavaScript.
All right, excellent. So welcome, everybody. As Paul mentioned, this is using a secure Web API web service from a mobile app. Now, Don, you know, when we were originally speaking, the way we came up with the idea for this was, you know, we had some questions from the customers. So what do you constantly hear from customers that sort of brought us to this idea?
Well, a lot of people are interested in getting started with Web API, and they also want to have it like secured. But yeah, the JavaScript portion of it, or basically the client-side portion of it, seems to be a problem for a lot of people. So that's why we set up this webinar.
So that's exactly what we're going to show today. And the agenda is pretty much, we're just going to, in three parts. Really, the first part is very small. We pretty much all know what an API is these days, but I'm just going to talk about the what and the why and some of the lingo and the terms around it. And then we're going to dive right into creating a web service. I'm going to show you through Visual Studio how to create a web API service, how easy it is, and how to secure it. And it's actually, you'll be surprised, quite easy because Visual Studio puts in a lot of interesting key pieces that we need. And then Don's going to jump in and show us how to consume that from any client-side app. So, and he's going to be using DevExpress to show that. DevExpress is our excellent hybrid mobile app framework. All right, so let's just dive right into it. The first thing is I'm going to be talking a lot. You're going to hear us use all these different terms today. So I'll talk about Web API in a second, but you've probably heard of REST, EndPoints, JSON, and OAuth, and I'll quickly define that. But JSON, if you're not familiar, is just a format that's lighter than, let's say, XML. It doesn't have as many tags and so forth. I'm a big fan of JSON. And so JSON is very popular in the Web API world. So, and what is this? A Web API is simply just a subset of an API, meaning that it allows you over the web to do the same thing an API does. So but why would you use an API? Well, the key thing with an API is to remember is that when you have a website that has a user interface, you have a lot of things we take for granted. For example, how security is done, how we talk to the data, and you know, a lot of things that we get by default that because we're running just straight in the browser. But an API allows us the ability to expose a set of functionality without a user interface directly to all sorts of different clients, whether they're on mobile or in a client-side spot framework or even other websites. So an API is great, and you have a central way to control business logic and so forth. So an API is very important these days because, you know, you have major companies like Twitter, Facebook, Google, and just yesterday, Microsoft announced graph.microsoft.com, I think it is. That is their unified way that you can access Microsoft services through their online API. And so API allows you to extend functionality by exposing functionality to your other developers out there so they can build on your platform. So REST is a key term. REST essentially is a pattern. And so what REST allows us to do is, REST is essentially, they say it's the way we should all use HTTP. So for example, REST dictates that the use of delete to erase a document, which could be behind a URI, is what you would call. Instead of saying something like get, and when we put like $delete equals ID22, we should actually be calling the delete verb. So HTTP provides us these verbs like get, put, post, and delete. And as you can see, they map right to CRUD. But REST is the way we should use them properly. So instead of using get and then passing a parameter called delete, we should actually be calling delete. So REST essentially allows us to do that. And we're going to see a little bit about the HTTP verbs in today's webinar. And let's quickly talk about endpoints. Endpoints are simply those points on a URL that you hit. So if you hit somewhere like on a google.com/IP, then you might return the IP to you, or headers, or get, put, post, and delete. So these are essentially the endpoints that an API generates. Now, the key thing to understand in today's webinar is this model here, this model of OAuth. And OAuth is a format that was created to deal with providing authentication and authorization to third parties. So what that means is, say you are Twitter, and you have a bunch of users. And then the users want to use some third-party application like Tweetbot, TwitPic, whatever. But the way this application works is it needs access to your Twitter account. Well, the way it needs to do that is going to be by asking Twitter. And so Twitter says, okay, I know who my users are. I don't know who this app is. So this app has to say, hey, would you please authenticate me with Twitter so I can, on your behalf, access your account and provide you some useful information, pictures, whatever it is. And so this involves a lot of trust. And so OAuth allows us to do that. And so as you can imagine, rather than saying, oh, well, I'm going to open up twitter.com, now you log in, now you add me this code, et cetera, this format with OAuth essentially says, listen, when the original request for the resource, which is on twitter.com, is done, I'm going to redirect to twitter.com, and then it's going to go to a response on the server is going to go back to the owner. So the owner now is going to authenticate saying, hey, some guy over here wants access to your Twitter account. Are you okay with that? And then, of course, you're going to tell Twitter back, yeah, that's totally fine. Then the important bit is Twitter's going to go, okay, I know who you are now, and here is a token. So that token now is going to reside with this client, and then the client's going to go, hey, I've got the authorization, we're good to go, you can start using me with your Twitter account. And we're going to show you this flow and how it works with WebAPI today. And really we wanted to show you how it works not just through the clients, but over the wire. So we're going to show you using a sort of a Chrome extension as well. Now, a couple of key things to understand in this world of WebAPI and OAuth is that because you don't have a user interface, it's key to identify yourself, meaning that your clients are not coming from the same domain. They're coming from different domains all over the web. So authentication and authorization become real important. So what's the real difference? Well, authentication is knowing the identity of the user. For example, you have a user named Alice, and she can log in with her username and password, and the server uses the password to authenticate Alice. And authentication, as you can see, happens at the host level, whereas an authorization is deciding whether a user is allowed to perform an action. So for example, Alice has permission to get a resource but not create a resource. So now that we understand the overall terms, let's just dive right into it. I'm going to use Visual Studio, and let's create a new service. I'm going to say, you can just go File, New Project, or you can use this little shortcut here. And in Visual Studio 2015, I'm going to use the ASP.NET Web Application template. Now, I'm not using ASP.NET 5. That changes things around, and they're still quite not finished with it yet. But when they are, we can always make an updated version of this. But in essence, they've made Web API built into these templates here. So I'm going to make something called SF Film API. Now, I call it Film because I'm using a database that I downloaded from the data.gov initiative, which exposes government data. Because it's public data, they have now just provided it online. So this is a list of film locations, and it has information about the title of the movie, actors, but also GPS coordinates of where it was located. And this one particularly comes from San Francisco. So I just downloaded that, put it into a SQL Express database, and I thought it would be more interesting than just saying value 1 and value 2. So we're going to use this ASP.NET Web Application template, which is their one application template. And let me say File, New Project again, and SF Film Location. I'm sorry, Film API. All right, so now this brings up the one ASP.NET dialog, which has all of their different platforms up there. Now I'm going to, by default, just keep WebAPI in here as this default selected here. And what it gives me is not just a WebAPI templates, but also an MVC site. And that's because API doesn't have a visual interface, Microsoft in their wisdom thought, hey, it'd be useful to provide some kind of UI. So and a starter MVC site is helpful as well. Now, we're going to have authentication on this, and this is how you secure your API. Choose some authentication models here. Now, in this webinar, Don and I are going to choose individual user accounts. Now, these are the user accounts that you typically get when you select file new, if you do new MVC or new web form site, and you just get those register login links. And this is a local SQL Express database. So you might say, yeah, but there's this whole new thing with identity, and you mentioned Twitter and Facebook. Absolutely. And you can, if you wanted to go that route, and if you need to support Active Directory or Office 365 or Twitter or Facebook, you can choose this work and school accounts. And we're gonna talk a little bit later. But if you are interested in this, we can make sort of a part 2 to this and sort of dive a little bit deeper. For now, we want you to really focus in and understand the default credential workflow and what happens when you make a secure web API and how do you consume that. So we're focusing on sort of the bare essentials right now. And once you get that under your feet, it makes it really much easier to deal with individual accounts and so forth. All right, so I'm just going to click OK and let it create for me a new project. Now, the new project is including MVC, and web API is very much similar to MVC in that it has routes, controllers. Of course, it doesn't have views. And if you're familiar with MVC, you'll notice that MVC, most controllers, derive off of the controller class. Well, you'll notice that in Web API, so for example, I won't go over this too much, but essentially, the controller, the home controller, derives off a controller. And so, by convention, there's a home because of our home controller and the index view to represent our index action. And you might say, well, where's my API? Well, let's actually take a look at this in the browser first. So I'm just going to run this, and what we're going to see right away is that we have a standard. Let's run this over here. We have a standard ASP.NET MVC template, and you might say, yeah, there's the default bootstrap looking thing. Yeah, that's bootstrap and all that, but they've added one extra menu item. Now when you click this API, you might think, oh great, it'll show me what my API is. It actually doesn't show you the API as much as it takes you to a help page. Now you might say, well, why a help page? Well, again, remember, your client, when you make an API, your client is other developers. You're actually exposing to other developers. And what is the one key trait about other developers? Well, just ask yourself, are you going to use something that doesn't have good documentation, that you have no idea what the call is? Well, of course not. So good documentation is important, and Microsoft is kind of helping promote that by telling you, hey, listen, when you make a site and you have an API, make some kind of helpful page like this. And so this page, all it does is says, listen, in this website, there's also an API, and the way you get to the points of the API is you need to go to /API, and there's if you want to get to any of the account stuff, go to the account controller. And so API/account, login and register and logout, they all correspond to things that we normally do through a user interface. And then if you want to get to the values controller, which provides you some information on values, then go to API/values. And as we know, because we're going through the routing, there will be a values controller. And the one key thing that differentiates it is that it derives from API controller. And because it derives from API controller, we don't have to decorate our class with attributes like HTTP, post, and stuff. A lot of that is already inferred for us. So, which brings us to the next thing. Well, we have this controller. So let's take a look. How do we get to those values? So if I go to API/values, the first thing I get here is, uh-oh, sorry, request has been denied. Well, that is one of the key things on how do you secure a web API service. Quite simply, you decorate your controller with the Authorize attribute. By just doing that at the top of your controller class, you have locked it down. regardless of what model you use, if individual user accounts or Facebook or Twitter login, Active Directory, adding this adds that capability right to your project. And you can also bypass this. You can do things like override authentication or allow anonymous. Now, I don't recommend them, but it's possible. So at the top, we can say the entire class is locked down, but individual methods like get might have allow anonymous. So let's just take a quick look at this. Now, let's say I want to get these values here for this get. So I'll say allow anonymous. Let's rebuild it and reload it. And now, when I call the get, it should return me a string array of 2 values. Well, if we take a look and reload it, it's by default it's going to go to /get, and it's going to return me that string array of 2 values, which isn't really very interesting, and it's also returning me XML. So what I'm going to do is bring in that database of film locations that I mentioned. But again, I don't recommend doing this. It's a bad idea because you're essentially bypassing your authorization. So you want to be very careful and instead keep your authorization, but simply you can get very granular and say, listen, some people have rights to this method and some don't, and you can control that either by user. So through Authorize, you can also say, hey, who are the users that have access to the controller, or by roles. So you can get pretty granular and make this much more interesting. All right, let's make this API more interesting. So right now, I don't really have that database. So let me bring in this database. Now I'm going to bring in a couple of things that we've already created, and I promise to tell you exactly what we are bringing in. So the first thing is, I'm going to open up this folder in Explorer View, and rest assured, we've got this project. It's already available on GitHub. I'm not going to tell you now because I want you to keep watching this webinar, but for sure, we'll tell you afterwards because we do want you to download, fork, make pull requests, all that good stuff. All right, so I'm going to paste in here some of these things. Now, I've put in, and I'll tell you exactly what I did. So rather than go through that interface, let's go through here and do show all files. And now it's going to show us all the files that are in the folders. So the first thing is obviously the SQL Express database. So I'm going to bring that in. And then I've updated file and app style called WebAPI config. Now, I'm a big fan of JSON, and by default, it provides us an XML. So this essentially says, listen, by default, I want you to provide JSON and not XML. So that's the only line that I've updated in there. And then I've actually, because I've brought in my database, I've actually used Entity Frameworks. We generated a couple of files called film and film detail. So let's include these in our project. And I'll explain what DTO is in just a second. And then I've also updated our identity model to create an application DB context and these database entities that are tied with DB set that says, yes, I've got a SQL Express database. So they're more directly tied with the back end than I would like, and that's why I have these DTOs. And I'll explain that in more detail in just a second. And then, of course, I have our web config, and I've got a link to my database. And finally, I have updated our global ASX file because of cross-domain. So let's talk about cross-domain real quick. So cross-domain is this concept that in the website world, everything lives in the same domain. When you come to DevExpress.com, you are essentially going to be in the DevExpress.com world. So for example, if you go to DevExpress.com, when you log in, you're still at DevExpress.com. When you purchase, when you download, you're doing everything in the same domain. However, in the world of cross-domain, we can't assume that, because when you're in the same domain, we can make some assumptions like all the security settings are going to be inherited from the web host. So there's a lot of things we get, and we can essentially disallow any request coming in that is not from DevExpress.com, because as we know, in the world of web, that is a common hack, meaning that it's known as cross-site request forgery, and we disallow it. So if somebody from Yahoo or some weird Gmail account tries to do something from DevExpress.com, we're going to say, sorry, you're trying to do something, we don't know who you are. So we're going to disallow anything that is cross-domain because we're handling security from the same domain. But in the web API world, cross-domain is not just necessary, but needs to be allowed. So And why is that? Well, because our clients are not coming from the same domain. They're coming from mobile apps, desktop JavaScript apps, spy applications. And so we're handling security through WebAPI. And that's why authentication and authorization is so important. All right, so to enable that, you actually need to tell Visual Studio, hey, listen, when some request comes in and is not from the same origin, that's okay. And so this bit of code here, which I won't go through the headache of typing, but don't worry, it'll absolutely be available, and people have asked us how do you enable it. It's simply this one method you add in your file, and then make a call out in your begin request that says, hey, listen, yeah, allow cross-domain, and you should really, that's why it's important to have that Authorize tag on your controller. Okay, now let's quickly talk about DTO. Don, do you remember we did a webinar on data transfer objects?
Absolutely.
All right, data transfer objects are, we did that in a whole hour. Now, let's not redo that, but if you could you paste a link to that in the sort of chat if people are interested? It would take a whole hour to try to go through it, but I'll quickly summarize. Again, as I said before, this entity model is aware. It's database generated. It's from Entity Framework, and identity model says, yeah, it's of type DB set. And so that's totally fine, but when I deal with this in the concept of serialization, it's going to cause me some problems. So what I've done is I made an identical class that is plain, that doesn't derive from anything, and yet it has ID, title, release year the same way Film does. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this data transfer object. Anytime I deal with this, I'm going to do sort of a switcheroo and say instead, take that and copy it over to something that is not bound over to that DB set. And that is not just a good practice, as we talk about in the webinar and all the good reasons, but for this specific webinar and this project, we're doing it because it helps us avoid circular references when serializing to JSON. All right, so now that I mentioned that, let's actually create a controller that does that. So I'm going to actually right-click and say Add, and Microsoft makes it really easy. Now, if you do this and select WebAPI to controller with actions using Entity Framework, it brings us this nice dialog. Now, when you select Film, it's already aware, and select DB context. Now, make sure before you do this that you do compile the project. Now, by default, by convention, because my model class is called Film, it's going to bring in a controller, create a controller called Films. And essentially, it's going to scaffold for me the entire thing. So what I'm going to do in the interest of time is bring in that controller class, and I promise you it exactly generates this thing. So what it essentially does, it creates these exact call. In fact, this is generated by Visual Studio. I haven't changed anything yet, but I'm going to, and I want to show you what you need to change and what you should change just as a best practice. So as I mentioned, right now it makes us all the calls like get by ID, put, post, and delete, and which is really nice because it's aware of all the properties and it's aware ID is the primary key and all that good stuff. And it generates an application DB context for us, right? But as I mentioned, that's tied directly to that DB set, and I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is when I call get films, to get my list of films, I'm going to use a different, I'm going to use a slightly different set of code that makes it a little bit easier for me. And so what I want to do is say, listen, get me that, whenever you go through and get me that list, go through and stuff it into something else. So as you can see, I've got get films, DB films, and I'm going to replace it with simply very similar code where I'm still looping through DB films, but every time I get a film object, I say, hey, take that film object, take all its properties, and create a new film DTO object and set its properties. And then return that film list array of film DTO objects instead of the film objects. And it's fantastic. So now I have these data transfer object, and it does the exact same thing and makes it much easier for serialization. And also, if I wanted to customize it, so if there's any other properties or methods I want to further enhance this DTO to without having to worry that the entity framework might complain or try to update my database or something like that. It just gives us a lot more options. It's a better approach to it. Now, because I updated my get, I want to also update my get by ID, and so I will update this method as well. All right, let's save this, build this, and now I want to see what it looks like in the browser. So the first thing is I'm going to, after it loads, go to /API, and instead of going to values, I want to go to the new controller I made called films. And when I say films, it's by default, the default routing is saying, yeah, go to get, and it's going to get me this list of films. And as you can see, I've got my list of films. And you might be wondering, hey, Mehul, that looks really nice. Well, first, it's returning JSON. And second, I'm using a couple of Chrome extensions. And I promise I'm going to have a blog post afterwards that has a list to all the links that I mentioned in here, as well as the extensions that I'm using. There's different ones available, but this sort of just prettifies, I don't know if that's a good word, but it makes my JSON looks really nice, and I can collapse and expand that kind of stuff. But here's my list of films. I've got my ID, I've got this title with a capital T and all that good stuff. So, but the one key thing is, you might say, yeah, Mehul, but where's your authentication? Well, as you remember, we have to do that at the controller level. So let's make sure, and we put in the Authorize attribute tag. And now, when I try to call, oops, let's make sure we compile. In the new ASP.NET, they've enhanced a lot of this functionality, but in this ASP.NET, we still got to compile and reload. So what we do is we're going to compile, and now it's going to say, hey, sorry, I don't know who you are. All right, so Don, I've made this website, and as you know, we've already put it up into one of your Azure website things. So how do we consume this, Don? I mean, what do we need to do to say, hey, I've got this web API, how do I authenticate? How do I do this whole shebang with, you know, authentication, authorization?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what we're going to discuss right now, because I think the most important thing to start with is to show you what is actually involved in getting the whole authorization done, and then being able to use that authorization to make those secure calls. So these are basically the steps that we're going to pursue in this client-side portion of the webinar. And for that, I have downloaded a little tool which is called Get Postman, which is invaluable tool for this kind of exercises. And you can just get it from getpostman.com, and it installs as either a Chrome app or a Chrome plugin. So that means that you can also get it from the Chrome store, and I have already installed it. So this is basically how it looks. It's like this window where you can actually make requests, and you can also use all the methods that Mehul has been discussing. So we can do the REST calls like get, put, post, delete. And more important, we can also manipulate the data we are sending out, or we can manipulate the headers that are being sent out. And that's pretty convenient to show you what is involved to get that data from that secure server. So
it's a really nice tool, and it looks really good too. And again, because we don't have a UI, this is a great way to test those endpoints.
Exactly. Yeah. So what we're going to do first is here you can actually specify the verb that you want to do, and there are a couple of other things in there as well. But we'll stick to the REST ones, which is the get, the post, and we'll not use the put and the delete in this webinar, but it'll be the same basically. So what happens when I specify this URL, which is the endpoint of the web API server, exactly as Mehul has created in, but then on Azure. If I send out this request, I will get something back, and that is because there is something in my headers. So let me open it up in a new screen, because that's way cooler. So here I have it, and you'll see that I get the same message that Mehul got back in his browser. Authorization has been denied. So how can we get authorized by just using these URLs and these endpoints and stuff? Well, the way that works is we need to authenticate basically. And if I go to my slide deck, to the next slide, you'll see that the local login procedure is basically the same as you would use by logging in on a website. You will need to enter your username and your password. That will be sent over to the authorization server, and if you're validated, you will get a token back, and that token is an encrypted piece of information which will hold a number of things, like we'll see that in a minute, which is important. And whenever we do a call to a secure endpoint, so to the films controller, we need to send that token with the request to the server. And then the server is able to decode that token, it will check a number of things, and then the server knows who we are, and yeah, he will allow or disallow, depending on the role that you're in, the call basically. So as said, we first need to do this authorization call, and for that, I mean, in this slide there is the authorization server block and the resource server block. So the resource server is basically the web API controllers, and the authorization server is something which is built in the web API service as well. And that has a special endpoint. So let me get back to my Postman tool. And what we need to do is we need to do the authorization. And as mentioned, that's already built in the web API service, and that is running on an endpoint which is called token.
And that is really nice benefit of using that Web API template. So Microsoft's Web API 2 and all its latest, OAuth, and it's all supported, but they give you an authorization server. So when we created that Web API template, we got an authorization server out of the box with this token endpoint. That's awesome.
Exactly, yes. So we now need to send over some stuff, but we don't have a user interface, so we need to specify that in the body. And if you want to specify something in the body, it's disabled by, now, then we have to change our verb to post, because we need to post something to the server. And now I can switch over to body, and well, one of the ways to submit this data is the xwww form URL encoded way. I'm going to select that one, and I'm now able to enter a number of form fields, basically, as if you were submitting a form. The first thing that I'm going to post is the grant type, because this token endpoint is not only able to authorize username and password, but it can authorize a number of other things as well. But in this case, we're going to do the password one, so that's also going to be the grant type. Well, if you want to use the grant type password, you will need to specify a username, and I already created one on my Azure website, which is donw@devexpress.com, and it will also need that password. And I've chosen a fairly simple one, just like this. So this data will be submitted to the endpoint token. When I hit send now, it's going to be submitted, and the response is right here. And it holds some interesting information, and it also holds the thing that we have been talking about on this webinar, which is the actual token. And as mentioned, it's an encrypted portion of information, and it contains basically also a number of things like when the token was issued, when the token expires, which is in about 2 weeks, and the token type, which is also an important thing. This is a bearer token, so that means that we are validated and we can do the calls basically. You also have a couple of other token types, but we'll not get into that in this webinar. But yeah, this is the information that we need, and the information that is here, like the token type, expires, and it's all information that's not really like secret, so the rest of the information is obviously encrypted inside that token. So this is the first call that we need to make. And once we have that, let me open up a new tab. We can try hitting that films controller again. So I'll copy over the URL, paste it in here, and I'll make it the API films one. And now, yeah, we have to send that token with the request. So how we're going to do that? Well, I'm now able to add a header value. And that header value is something which will hold the token, obviously. And the way that it works, and this is one of the things which more or less makes it all happen, is I'm going to specify an authorization header. And the value of it will be bearer. And I'll switch back to the other tab. I will now just copy over that token, just like that. Copy it over in my clipboard, switch back to this call, and I'm going to paste it like right after bearer, space. The space is really important. So the token is in here. When I now hit send, the server knows who we are, and you'll see the list of the films returned from the secured endpoint of this film controller. And this is the magic, how it actually works.
So in essence, you just did a similar concept to like logging into a website, but now because your client is out there, you know, this token becomes very valuable, right? So now, exactly. This token, you can cut and paste it, give it, you know, if people are watching and then they type the whole thing out, they could essentially use it. So the token is kind of important, but it's also sort of the magic binding that makes it all possible, right? Because you were saying, hey, here, take this token because I trust you, right? And that's how you establish the whole concept. Of course, you did go through the authentication, and if you have that set up well enough, then you won't have to worry that, okay, somebody is perhaps getting at the token and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. And the cool thing is that you only need to do that login sequence once. And basically, you saw that the token expires in 2 weeks. So even if you go back to the site tomorrow and you happen to still have that token from today, you can use that same token again and hit that endpoint again, and you don't even need to do the login. So the token is valid for a certain amount of time. And the cool thing is, now I have that header specified here, I can also call another call of this film API. So for instance, if I want to have the details of, for instance, 40 days and 40 nights, which has an ID of 3, I can now specify /3, and it will send out that same token. And I will now get the details of this film, basically.
All right, so Don, that's great. Now we understand completely what happens over the wire. How do we call this from the client side? Let's say a JavaScript app or a mobile app.
Yeah, so that's a very good one. And for that, I've already started up Visual Studio, and I'm going to do this by using our DevExpress JavaScript framework. And that's set up fairly simple by just going to New Project. I'm going to create a basic application. And once I hit OK, it's been set up in a couple of seconds. So I will set up like the basic application. I will not go.
While that's getting set up, Don, what about just like if I wanted to call this from jQuery or something like that?
Yeah, that also is. Yeah, let me show that. That's a good one actually, because the calls that are necessary to do, I've put them down in the slide deck. So let me switch over. If you want to do it yourself from JavaScript, this is actually the way that it works. So what you see, you will store that token somewhere. In this case, it's stored in the session storage. And if that token is available, we will create an object which will hold the headers.authorization, which is basically the same that I entered in the Postman tool. And then when I hit the jQuery AJAX call, I will specify a header option with it, which will contain that token. And well, if everything goes okay, I will have the done function executed, and if something is not okay, for instance authorization failed, then I will have that show error thing going on. And yeah, this code is necessary to do it in JavaScript yourself.
So this is the exact same thing you did, the last thing you did in Postman, where you, in the header, had a token, passed it in, and then you're making the exact same GET call, but you're using, like you mentioned, the AJAX synchronous call. So are you saying every time you want to do a GET, you got to make this kind of like GET, put, post, or delete, you got to write this?
Yeah, basically you have to, and I didn't even specify the login sequence.
Ooh,
Because you
okay.
have
So
to
that
get
could be a lot of
that
code.
Yeah, well, it can be quite a bit of code, yeah. So that's why I decided to create something to ease up your life, so you don't need that much code. And that's what I'm going to show in our little DevExpress project. So let me get back to Visual Studio. The project has been created. I'll not go into details on how this stuff has been set up because Paul and Julian has done a number of webinars on basic stuff of DevExpress, how it all works and how to get it running and stuff. The only thing I'll do right now is I will just start up the application, which will show, try that again, and let me quickly restart my Visual Studio.
But the basic application template you're using does give you sort of a mobile app template that is still, gives you the look and feel for Android, Windows, all the platforms that DevExpress supports.
Yeah, exactly. And if you start up this project after the project template has been finished, you will have like a home view and you'll have like an about view. And I will now quickly create a new project, and we're going to add some extra stuff in it, obviously, to make the calls and also to give the user the possibility to enter his username and passwords to get authorized and all that kind of stuff. And well, I have prepared a little NuGet package for you, which allows you to set this up in virtually minutes. And that's what we're going to do right now. So let me first see if Visual Studio decided to work again by starting it up, so we don't have any issues afterwards. And as said, this is the basic application. It's got a home view, it's got an about view, and you can even switch in a little emulator to Android or even to Windows Phone. But again, I'll not dive too deep into this stuff because there are a couple of webinars that Paul and Julian did, and they cover this all.
Yeah, it's a great tool, saves a ton of time. As you can see, we're going to build a mobile app in second and consume that Film API, theoretically, right?
Yeah. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to include this NuGet package by right-clicking the solution, hit Manage NuGet Packages. If you just search, this is just on the NuGet.org feed, so if you just search for JavaScript WebAPI, you'll get, the first hit that you'll get is like this little NuGet package with the DevExpress icon in front of it. And I do like to mention this is for this webinar setup, and it is for educational purposes, so you can use it any way you like. You can modify it, you can do whatever you like with it, but this is set up to make your life a bit easier.
We'll repeat that bit at the end again, but what Don has done is created, when we were first originally looking at this, we're like, oh, you got to write that jQuery code here and there. I'm like, there's got to be some GitHub thing out there or NuGet package. And he goes, well, not really. And so he's like, look, I think, we can just make a small library. And I said, okay, well, that's great. The thing is, because we're presenting it, people might think, okay, well, this is a DevExpress thing. Not really. This is a Don thing. And we keep Don pretty busy. So he'd be very happy to keep this updated. But what's more is this is it's out there on GitHub, this NuGet package at the core of it. And we'd love for you to just fork it, send in pull request, which says, hey, we fixed this or we made this better, and we'll put it. So if you like it, use it. But, please don't contact DevExpress support directly about this NuGet package. This is just meant as a helper thing. You don't need it, but it just saves time, as you'll see in just a second.
Yeah, exactly. So in the meantime, I installed the package. It will open up a little README file, and don't close it straight away if you want to test it, because it's got some valuable information you need to copy and paste to get it running in your application. The package has added a number of things, which are a couple of views, like the DX sign-in, the DX register, and the DX confirm external. So if I open this DX sign-in, for instance, it is giving you a nice view where you can enter your username and your password, and you can get authorized on the Web API service. So it will just save you some work. It's not really rocket science, but you'll have it, and it's easy to use.
So this is so you don't hard code in the username and password into your code, so that way they can actually log in? Okay.
Yeah. Well, also you see the second link on this little screen here that has a link to register in case you didn't have a username and a password. It will route you to the register view, which is also set up. It allows you to specify an email address, a password, and you need to retype it again. And again, it's just really basic, but it will save you some time.
Okay. Now, these are the type of screens you typically get with a new ASP.NET site when you use individual user accounts anyways. Yeah. And an end user would have to recreate those. So, you created these 3 different views. They're specific to DevExtreme, but the core of the calls, that's not specific to DevExtreme. That's right.
No, absolutely. So another thing that has been added is this Web API client GS file, and that will hold the actual code which will do all the steps that I have been showing you manually. It will have a whole bunch of stuff in there, and you can check it out yourself. It's pretty okay code, and it's pretty readable as well. So you'll manage to figure out how that works.
So this is where the magic happens. This is where you do the AJAX get, and you're just parsing, and so you've essentially templatized the concept, right? So it makes it just much easier, and it's easier to call like single line of code. So you're actually grabbing the HTTP return code and
Yeah, I'm doing the actual AJAX call here, as you can see, and that object that has been sent is pre-filled with all the stuff that we need and a couple of other things, and yeah, it just reuses a bit of code so you don't have to type it in every time, so it just saves you some work.
All right, nice.
So I'm gonna head back quickly to my README file because, as mentioned, there is some valuable information in here, and that is the example on how to use it on DevExtreme. So first, we'll need to include the JavaScript file which is holding the class in the index.html to make sure that we'll have that stuff ready to go. So I'm going to
You're making the solution aware of these files that just got added by NuGet?
Exactly, yeah. So then I know, obviously out of my head, what comes next, but I'll switch back to the README anyway. Next we need to register the views, the DX views, to the application. So I will just copy over these lines of code, get back to the index file, and paste it all the way at the bottom.
So now the client-side version of include in project, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Got it.
So now the application is aware of those views, so we can actually use them. So that needs to be done for the index.html. Then if I get back to the README file, we also need to instantiate something. And well, I set up this NuGet package and I try to make it as easy as possible, but we do need to do a couple of customizations and also to keep this client generic, so not really bound to DevExtreme. So I will copy over this code. You can literally copy this over exactly and put it in the index.js file. And once we paste it in, I'll explain what it does. The last line is basically the most interesting one, but because that will actually create this Web API client instance, and it will store it in a global DB object in the window. But you'll notice here that we need to replace this with the app object of DevExtreme, and the way that works is the application is hosted inside this JavaScript object, so I need to copy this over and replace it here. It's something I couldn't automate that quickly, so this is one of the steps that you need to do manually. And we also need to put this application object on 3 other places, which is basically in the view model code of the sign-in, and again I've put it here in as well. You can just paste it in. If there is some PowerShell King listening right now and knows a way for me to get that application ID and replace it in the files, please contact me and I'll put the PowerShell script in the NuGet package. But for now, this is basically the stuff that we need to change. And obviously there is one other thing that we need to change, which is the URL of our endpoint. So I'm going to get back to Postman and I'm just copying over this domain. So the rest is not needed. And I'm going to paste it in right here. Well, this create WebAPI client is a function which is right above, and it is useful to keep this function like pasting it in because it makes it, otherwise you have to change things on a couple of other places as well. But what it basically does, it creates an action events object which will allow you to perform certain actions once you have been authenticated, or once you need to be signed in, or once you do something else. And here you can use specific framework features, and in this case we are using specific DevExpress features to route you to a specific view, but you can change that. If you're not using DevExpress, you can change that behavior altogether. So this makes it generic for a lot of frameworks basically. So the last thing that I'm going to do, let me do a quick build to see that everything is included, etc. is setting up a view which will display the list of films. So I'm going to create a new view which I will call films. That will be registered in the system automatically in the index.html and stuff, so I don't need to do anything for that. And I will just strip out this default code. I'm going to the toolbox of DevExpress and I'm going to insert a list. And this list will be bound to a property of the view model, and this is going to be data source instead of that fixed array that we had. There's one other thing that I need to change, because the title, which is defaulted if you insert this list, the JSON feeds holds it with a capital T. So if I switch back to my Postman, you will see that the title is with a capital T, and something I need to change. So with that in place, that means that my view model should set up, it should have something, a property called data source. So let me quickly switch over to the view model and make that view model the way that it should work. So I'm going to put in the data source property, and I'm going to code in a view shown event, and that means that whenever this view is shown, that event will be fired. So that for holding that data, I will code in that view shown event, and that view shown event looks like this. This will make the actual call to the controller by using this DB object that we created on the index.js. It will call the films controller, in this case the default action. Well, because the call is asynchronous, we never know when it's finished. So we have to specify a method which will be performed once the data has been received, and we need to perform a method in case something fails. Well, you see that we are using a DS thingy here, so that's something I need to include as well. And while we're at it, I'm going to put a best practice on JavaScript in it anyway, which is a use strict on this function, so to make sure that the JavaScript is okay. And this DS is an observable array, so everything which is bound to this array will be notified and will be redrawn whenever the collection of this array changes, and that's what's happening right here. And then the last thing, in case things go wrong, I need to have this data source method, and that will just give me a little notification from DevExpress that something went wrong basically. So this is actually quite a bit less code as the JavaScript stuff that was in the slide deck, if you remember. And once I run this application, you'll notice that we are able to actually get those films out of the web service. So you'll see the films one, I could actually change the icon, but now I hit that endpoint and I get an authorization error back. So it will redirect me to this default view from the NuGet package. And when I now log on with donw at devexpress.com, paste in that same password and hit sign in, it will actually say you have been signed in, and that means that I have the token in my client application. When I now hit films again, you'll see that I have the list of films.
Very nice. So that library of yours essentially saves all that trouble. All right, well let's wrap this up. I'm going to let's show this here. All right, so we're going to finally end this with some best practices and some things you might want to understand about the Web API world. The first and foremost, if you make a Web API, I don't care if it's internally, externally, use SSL. We didn't do it today just for the sake of time. It's actually pretty easy, and you can do it in a number of different ways. And the first is you can add it at the host level at IIS, but I recommend you go further than that. You can actually do it on your controller and even specifically on action by saying require HTTPS. There's a great article, and again I'll have a blog post if you go to devexpress.com/Mehul on this with all these links. But this link here will take you to the Microsoft article that talks about how you can even
Sorry, Mehul, we're not seeing your screen.
Oh, thank you. All right, sorry. So now, as I mentioned, you can do it locally as well through IIS Express and generate a temporary certificate and all that good stuff. So just for the sake of it, just remember, if you're not using HTTPS, people can see what's going across the wire. Just remember, you're naked out there. It's not healthy. As much as possible, HTTPS all the way. All right, the next best practice is actually about API design. And yes, you can get kind of a little bit too crazy with this. So, you know, my recommendation, I've included some links, not just for the overall guidance, but sort of a pragmatic approach too, which says, look, you know, create something that's useful because your end users are actually developers. But keep it simple. Don't go overboard. Don't be like, oh, it has to be this specific way to be this RESTful. You know, just make sure that you read up a little bit on it, and that way you don't make something crazy like get film 24, something like that, right? Don't be too specific. Be generic enough that people can kind of expect that, oh, if I'm going to get tasks, then if I want to get a specific one, I'll go / with the ID number. And so that's, you know, something a developer might expect to do. Okay. The next best practice is if you are going to make a API, you might want to consider using the cloud. And the reason is this actually can make your life a lot simpler. If you have a really big API, then you know your audience is developers, but also you're going to want to make a portal for them with a nice set of documentation, what's available, and where they can sign in and get a token and all that stuff. And then you also need an admin portal. Well, sites like Azure or an Apogee, they provide what's called API management. And so you would simply expose your backend, and then they provide all these layers for you, and if a proxy if you need, and you know, CDN or replication and all that good stuff. So you can monitor and find out who's using what and how many calls they're making. So you know, stuff you could build yourself, but it's a lot easier with the cloud approach. If you're going to have really a big API, you might want to consider going that route. Now finally, I'll mention that if you're going to make a public API, use something called Swagger. Swagger provides what's called metadata. Now, if you remember the old web services world, you had a WSDL, Web Service Descriptive Language or something. In the Web API world, you have, I think, a WADL. And really, though, the favored approach these days is something called Swagger. And if you go to swagger.io, there's actually a number of different languages it supports in platforms like Ruby and PHP and all that, and of course ASP.NET. But it'll generate a metadata file for you that is descriptive and describes what your API calls are. And then when you put that in your website, sites like Programmable Web that indexes over 12,000 different public APIs will pick up on it and say, hey, I found a new one. So this SF Films API is available if we add a Swagger call and we want to promote it. So if you want to have a public API, definitely consider using Swagger. All right, with that, thank you very much. We really, really appreciate you joining us today. If you have any questions, contact us. We love to hear your feedback. I'm mharry@devexpress.com and Mehul on Twitter. Don is donw@devexpress.com and @donwba. And I believe we have most of the feedback covered. Is there any questions?
There's no outstanding questions at the moment. Oh, one cascade. Oh, now they're coming thick and fast. So from Joe, what is the recommended way to send large binary files?
For me, and Paul, you might have an opinion on this, and as Don, you might as well. For me, again, it's, how do I say it? If you really have to ask, like, what's the scenario, right? If you're asking, like, am I sending a large file through a mobile app? Well, that's exactly why services like, Dropbox and those were created, because you don't want to tie up a large HTTP call, even if it's asynchronous, right? It's still there in the background, and those kind of things can time out and stuff like that. So I think it becomes about, like, what is it that you're transferring? What is it? I mean, still to this day, right, Paul? When somebody contacts us on a support issue and they're like, hey, we've got this support issue. We want to send you our entire project, which is, 100 megs. What do? We say, okay, here's an FTP. Upload it to us through there, or send us a Dropbox link, right? But we don't say, go to DevExpress support and try to upload that file where it may or may not time out. So just look at the scenario and what you're trying to do.
I think there as well, Mehul, I'm a big fan of Azure. That's no secret, and there's some really cool SDKs available for larging move stuff into blob storage with that as well. So
now the other question I see about Angular, Paul and I are actually talking about this, and I think we're going to make a webinar on this, right, Paul?
We are. We're talking about Angular 2, but I know, for example, DevExtreme does have support for upcoming support for version 1.4, and certainly we're going to do a how to get started with Angular and DevExtreme.
Yep. It's actually much easier than you think, but we'll dive into it, help explain sort of the architecture of Angular and how DevExtreme fits into it, because DevExtreme is two things. It's the framework, but it's also the widgets. So you can use them with other frameworks like Angular as well.
And I do like to mention with the Angular approach, you can obviously use this same approach with Angular as well. You can just get the NuGet package. Obviously the views will not work with Angular, but the client class will work. So
hey, contact me and Don. Send us emails or Twitter, whatever you prefer. Let us know. Do you want us to make a part 2 to this where we use OAuth and connect using Facebook and Twitter or Active Directory? I mean, tell us what you'd like to see, and then we'd love to make a part 2. We might even throw the Angular bit in there as well to see, does it make sense to use Don's package, or which will definitely work. And I think Angular has some calls built into it as well. But there's always some advantages with using something too.
absolutely.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. We're at time, so we need to wrap it up. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Check out devexpress.com/webinars for all upcoming webinars and access to previously recorded sessions. And please note that today's webinar will also be available later on today on our DevExpress YouTube channel as well. That's about it for this one. Thanks to Don and Mehul, and thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Goodbye for now.